I have the task of providing a little bit of context for this day. And in some ways, the D-Day invasion 75 years ago is probably one of the most well-known events in history. It requires very little introduction on my part. It's been covered in films and documentaries, very, very famous. I'm sure all of you have seen at least some of them. For those of you who don't know, the D-Day invasion was the largest air, land, and sea operation in military history. It combined the armed forces of the United States and their allies, Britain and Canada. It included cooperation with French resistance fighters and thousands of representatives from other allied countries, both free and currently occupied by the Nazis. In the end, over 150,000 troops landed on June 6th, including over 4,000 that lost their lives. By the end of June, nearly 1 million Allied troops were in France, and just over 2 months later, Paris would be liberated. Now, for those of you who know my classes and things like that, you know that part of what we do as historians is talk about what happened. But even more, we talk about why. Why does it matter? Why does what happened in June of 1944 matter? What does it mean? Well, 3 years ago, I had the privilege of visiting Normandy. And for those of you who have been there, I'm sure you know exactly what I'm talking about. It is a site of somber reflection. It is a beautiful place, a rugged place. But when you walk through the cemetery at Covy-sur-Mer, it is a place of quiet reflection on the sacrifice that people committed to the cause of freedom. One of the events that happened to me while I was visiting Normandy was initially a tad embarrassing, I have to say. While on the beach at Utah Beach, I was reflecting on what had happened, and I heard some giggling and laughing behind me. And when I turned around, my 4-year-old and my 2-year-old were playing in the beach, playing in the sand, throwing sticks, splashing in the water. And my initial reaction to that was, oh, I gotta stop them. This is a sacred place. Children can't play here. But on reflection, I decided not to stop them. Because that place that had been soaked in the blood of men fighting for our freedom 70 some odd years before was now a place of laughter and of joy. And that is because of what those men fought for. The freedom for my children to play on that beach. And one of the things that we as historians try to do is we try to demythologize the past, to provide context, to talk about what happened and why. And in some ways, the D-Day invasion has taken on a little bit of mythology. But I think that despite that, it is still one of the most important events, certainly the Second World War, certainly of the 20th century and maybe beyond. And that is because the invasion was about so much more than just victory. In a letter written to his troops as they prepared to engage in this invasion, Dwight Eisenhower wrote many very famous things. I'm sure you've probably read it before, but I want to draw our attention to one line. He wrote, "In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world." For those of you who are students of World War II, you may know that by June 1944, the war was effectively won. The German war machine had been broken in 1943 on the Eastern Front by the Soviet victories, and victory was more or less assured. Earlier that year, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin had met in Iran to discuss the future that they were going to make for the world. Victory was apparent. The safe thing to do would have been to allow the Soviets to continue their offensive, to continue, as one historian said, to throw steel, not flesh, at the Germans, which had been the strategy to that point, using America and Britain's industrial might to arm and supply the Soviets to keep our troops out of harm's way. But if that had been the decision taken by our leaders and by our soldiers, the world would have looked very different. Because victory and liberation are not the same thing. Victory may have been assured, but in 1944, the liberation of Europe was not assured. And in some ways, I believe that that fact makes the sacrifices made in June of 1944 all that more special. The Germans were defeated, but the promises that we had made to our allies, to the peoples of Europe, that we were coming to set them free, those promises had not yet been kept. And the men and women who worked to put together this invasion, the young men who gave their lives on those beaches, they fought not just to defeat an enemy, they fought to free a continent. And I believe that living up to those promises, living up to those ideals, is what D-Day is actually all about. For those men and women, no cost was too great to defend the principles of liberty and freedom. Fighting alongside our allies, they fought not just to win a war, but to build a better future. Thank you.